Today I want to talk about an important subject that's of great interest to a lot of people, Jewish and Christian alike, and that is the relationship of Jesus to Jewish law. It's also, what I'm going to do today is a Jewish take on who Jesus was and to place him in his time and in his place, to place him in his time and in his place, to think about where he stood vis-a-vis the other Jewish movements of his time. I want to say at the outset that as a Jewish person, as a rabbi, I have great respect for Christianity, for its values, for its beliefs. Some of them, of course, I share. Judaism and Christianity share an awful lot, especially in the realm of morality. After all, Christian morality comes from the Jewish Bible, all of which Christianity accepts as sacred and as holy and as the Word of God. So there's a lot we share, but there's quite a bit that we don't share, and part of it has to do with who is Jesus, who was Jesus. A lot of Christians believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Jewish people would say he was as much the Son of God as all of us are. We're all children of God, but we do not believe that he was God or a part of God any more than we are. We do think that there was a Jesus, that there was a historical figure. For a lot of Jewish people, that means that he was a Jewish person who was born Jewish, lived a Jewish life, and died Jewish. And so what I have on the screen here is, according to the text about him in the Christian scriptures, that is, not in Jewish texts, in the Christian scriptures, what can we find relating to the question, did Jesus want to abolish Jewish law, thereby creating a new religion? In other words, who started Christianity? My answer for today is going to be it wasn't Jesus. In another session, I'll talk about who I think did invent Christianity. Or did he want to reinterpret Jewish laws within Judaism? If so, who started Christianity? Again, I'll get to that second question next time. But this time, I want to talk about how and why he wanted to reinterpret Jewish laws within Judaism. And so, again, I'm going to be looking at texts within Christian scriptures. Christian scriptures are not books that I or a Jewish person would consider to be holy and sacred, but they are of fantastic interest in learning about early Christianity and its beginnings, based on its attitude to who Jesus was. So again, one of the big splits between Christianity and Judaism, to be very obvious, is who do you think Jesus was? Was he a historical figure? Was he a major historical figure in his time? He certainly became a major historical figure over time, over the centuries, in a sense, not in a sense, plainly, one of the most historical figures of all time in human history. That's just a fact. But in his own time, how important was he? And next time I'll be talking about the little bit of evidence we have. And one of the key passages is from Josephus, a historian of that century, of that first century CE. And we'll come to question, was he very, very important in his own time? Again, very, very important to say the least, over time, but in his own time, how important was he? And what was he up to? What was he trying to do? Did he want to reinterpret Jewish laws within Judaism? So that's just to go over a little bit of the introduction. So who was Jesus? And how can we know who he was? And what text do we use? We're going to use Christian texts to talk about it. And again, I want to make this general statement. I have it here on screen. In general, here's what he said. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. We're going to look at that passage in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's talk about Matthew chapter 5 for a second. Sermon on the Mount is one of the most famous passages in Christian scriptures and maybe in world history. It's an incredible passage of incredible interest because in it, I think we have the Jesus of his own time. Why was it a mount? He was probably on a hill, but I think this is to be the equivalent of Moses on Mount Sinai, because he's going to be talking about what Moses did on Mount Sinai when he got the 10 Commandments, and he is going to reinterpret many of the 10 Commandments. But notice again what it says. Think in verse 17. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now let's remember what we're talking about when we say law. We're talking about the Torah. We're talking about Jewish law. We're talking about Jewish rituals. We're talking about Jewish morality. We're talking about the laws of the Hebrew Bible. That's what he meant by the law. And he's talking about the prophets. He's talking about the prophets of the Jewish Bible. He's talking about Isaiah and Jeremiah. And so he says, don't think I've come to start a new religion. Don't think I've come to get rid of Jewish law. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I want to make them stronger. For truly I say to you, right, till heaven and earth pass away, nothing should change from the law. Whoever then relaxes one of the least of these commands and teaches men, so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But he who does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, again, let's talk about what those laws are. Those are the laws of keeping kosher, of eating by the dietary laws of Judaism. Those are the laws of the Sabbath, of keeping the Sabbath holy on the seventh day, on what we would call Friday night and Saturday. When he's talking about not abolishing the law, he's talking about not abolishing Jewish law or the statements of the Jewish prophets. And he says, my mission is to fulfill them, make them better, reinterpret them. And if you mess with them, if you relax one of those things, if you take away keeping kosher, keeping by the Jewish dietary laws, if you don't do the Sabbath, you shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But if you do them, you shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. This is Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important passages in Christianity, if not the most important. And this is Jesus, and I assume that this is really Jesus talking, and that these are really his words, and that this is what he's saying. Now, if you think about it, this is not the way most people think. Most people think Jesus came to start a new religion. It was named after him, Christianity, after the idea that he was Christ, that he knew that he was the Son of God, that he thought he was the Messiah being a person descended from King David, who will bring about a different world where the wolf will lie down with the lamb, where even nature will change, where there will be no wars and no sickness and no death. Will there be peace on earth and goodwill towards all human beings? That's the idea of the Messiah. So most people would say, and when I talk to people and I haven't discussed these things with them, that's what they tell me, Jewish and Christian alike, that's who they think Jesus at least thought he was. And if you're a Christian, that's who he was. He was the Messiah. He was the Son of God. So, but if you look at just this passage that I'm emphasizing, look at what he's saying. I haven't come to get rid of Judaism. I've come to make Judaism better. Now, where does that put him in modern terms? Let's think for a moment about the modern movements of Judaism. And I'm doing this very quickly and very simplistically. In another one of these sessions, I'll be going into great depth about the different movements in modern Judaism. You have orthodoxy that says, we will preserve everything from the past. If laws come down to us, we will not change one iota, one dot of those laws. You have conservative Judaism, which says we want to conserve everything, but we want to make sure that everyone can participate in those laws fully and equally. So most of the changes that conservative Judaism has made have to do with women's rights so that everybody can do them. There's Reform Judaism that says we want to start from the bottom up. We're going to say, what are the main values of Judaism? They are ethics and monotheism, ethics and believing in one God. We're going to build up from there, but we can reject some of those commandments from the past because the ritual commandments were not really commanded by God. They were from human beings. Only the ethical ones come from God. And so again, we'll talk about this another time. And then there's Reconstructionism that says we're also going to reconstruct from the bottom up, but we don't believe in a personal God. We just believe that there were folk ways that have come down to us that we will or will not follow. And then, of course, there's the ethics, there's the morality of living a righteous human life. So those are the modern movements. There have always been different movements in Judaism. And just as there are many, many Christian denominations, and there's different parts of Islam, Judaism has never been one thing. Judaism has never been one thing. And in Jesus' time, it certainly was not one thing either. And we know that there were certain sects of Judaism, certain movements of Judaism. And one was called the Sadducees. They seem to have been the priests and the people devoted to the temple. According to some theories, they were a higher socioeconomic class. They wanted things just like they were. They wanted the status quo. When Rome came in the 60s BCE, a lot of them were involved, in getting along with the Romans. Remember that Jesus was born and died in Judea when the Romans were ruling it. Very important point. Jewish people did not have independence or autonomy. So we have these different movements, and that's the Sadducees. They did not believe in a life after death. For them, life was pretty good right here, and they didn't need to talk about that. In many ways, they were very biblical. Next come the Pharisees, who, at least according to theories, were more of the common people. And they wanted to separate themselves from certain things that were going on in the temple. They wanted to interpret things. They wanted to move things away from the temple to the home. So if you had an altar at the temple, now you had a kitchen table, and that's where we get our blessings, like saying the motzi or the kiddush, that is saying blessings at the table replaces the altar or is an alternative to the altar at the temple. The home becomes the temple. Eventually, you won't have priests who are hereditary caste. You'll have rabbis, which democratizes things. And the Pharisees did believe in the afterlife and life after death, and it became more and more important to them. So there were a lot of differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then there were the Essenes, people, at least some of whom were celibate. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were the ones who wrote and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes lived near the Dead Sea, at least a lot of them, and they were celibate, which means that they did not necessarily perpetuate themselves, and they didn't seem to live a long time. Why is that of interest when you think about Jesus? Well, if he was a 33-year-old Jewish guy at that time, to think that he might have been connected with the Essenes who were celibate is at least an intriguing thought. And nothing has ever come to show the relationship between Jesus and the Essenes, but there's something worth considering there. And then there were a whole lot of other people who really hated Rome and hated their oppression. Just to give you an example of the Romans, their method of execution was crucifixion. You've heard about crucifixion because you know about that Jesus was crucified. But what you might not know is that it was a common method of execution because it was cruel and it was barbaric. And the idea of putting somebody up on the cross is making an example to everyone. And the Romans wanted to make an example to everyone, not to mess with them, because they only had a few thousand soldiers in Judea. Remember, this was the days of the great Roman Empire, and they're spread out all over the place. And if there were 1 million people living in Judea and only thousands of Romans. They were always worried about rebellions. And so if anybody seemed to be rebellious or seemed to be causing trouble, they would crucify them and not even ask questions later. So the Romans were brutal. Sometimes in schools and elementary schools, they sort of glorify the Roman Empire. They were not necessarily such nice people, and in any of their methods. And they brutally invaded and conquered a big part of their known world. And there were a lot of people in Judea who didn't like them for all the obvious reasons. And one scholar who's very important to me, the late Jacob Neusner, talks about apocalypticists. That is, people who say the apocalypse is coming. This is the fight between good and evil. Let's rebel against the Romans. And in the year 70, they will rebel. Just to give you a time frame, we think that Jesus lived about 4 BCE and died in about 29 CE. At least that's a pretty good guess based on things about little hints we have in the Christian scriptures about when he lived and King Herod and things like that. So if that's true, he lived in the time of the temple when the temple was existing and very much in operation in Jerusalem and was the center of Judaism. People would make pilgrimages 3 times a year to Jerusalem. So I'm back to this passage. That's a little bit about the movements of his time. And so, as I was saying, we're talking about the passage about the Sermon on the Mount and where Jesus fits in. So just to go back for 1 second, Jesus is saying, I have not come to change anything. So that sounds, in modern terms, very orthodox. And and in the terms of his century, it almost sounds like a Sadducee. But this last verse 20 of this paragraph, that's very interesting in another way. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. He's saying, I'm going beyond everybody. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, all of these people who are so scrupulous about the law, I'm going to go further. And then he does. And in the passage, as the passage goes on, he's talking about the 10 Commandments. And so I'm just going to read what he says. You've heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill. Now the Hebrew, lo tirtzach, says, you shall not murder. And thou shalt not kill is really a mistranslation, not by Jesus, but by this translator and by a whole lot of other translators. There are times, unfortunately, that we have to kill in a war, especially of self-defense or against genocide. There is a time to kill, as Ecclesiastes would say. But you're not allowed to murder, obviously. And that is what that commandment says. And he says, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. If you murder, you will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, shall be liable to the hell of fire. What is he saying? He's saying, look, of course you should not murder. Of course you will be punished if you murder. I'm saying that there are other kinds of murders, that insulting another human being is a murder, that being angry at another human being is a murder. So it's not just that you should murder. I'm going way beyond that. I'm talking about your personal daily conduct. To be angry, to insult another. If you call somebody you fool, you shall be liable to the hell of fire. Think about it, what he's saying. Think about your own personal behavior in your daily life. Could you measure up to this? Do you never get angry? Do you ever insult somebody? In my family, there's a lot of banter, and people are saying things to each other all the time. And everybody loves everybody, but I got to tell you, sometimes, especially if we're playing some kind of competitive game, I don't know if anybody ever says "you fool," but there are probably some other choice words that people are called. Um, like when somebody loses and somebody wins. I mean, this is sort of normal talk. I don't know if we could measure up to this. And to say, if you call somebody "you fool," you'll be liable to the hell of fire. That's pretty high standard. It's a pretty tough standard. And yet, these are Jesus' words according to the Christian scriptures, according to perhaps his most famous speech, the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going down to verse 27. Okay, so that was one commandment of the 10 Commandments. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. It is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. I don't know how many people here remember Jimmy Carter, President of the United States. And when he was running for president, for reasons that I don't remember, he gave an interview with Playboy magazine. I guess he was trying to reach a certain audience or something like that. And in this very famous interview, he was asked, "Have you ever committed adultery?" He was married to a wonderful woman named Rosalind. He said, "Well, if, in a certain way I have, because I have lusted in my heart after other women. I haven't committed this sin of adultery, that is, in having sex with another woman, but I will tell you that I have sometimes had lust in my heart." All he was doing was quoting this passage, but it created a firestorm, because here was this presidential candidate saying, "I have lust in my heart." I think he was just being honest. I think he was just being human. But he was raised, he's steeped in Christian tradition and in these verses. And so he was trying to say, by Jesus' standards, yeah, I've committed adultery. By the usual standards that anybody else has, no, I haven't. But that sort of got lost in the shuffle, and this became a big deal. This is what everybody was talking about. But Jimmy Carter was trying to hold himself up to this standard. And he was saying, I have failed. I have done some of the things that Jesus said I should not do. Now, he didn't take out his eye. He didn't cut off his arm. But he hurt his presidential campaign for a while just by being very honest. So think about the two things we've said so far. They've been these very basic commandments of not committing murder and not committing adultery have been reinterpreted to the highest standards that I can really imagine at this moment. To say, if you insult somebody, it's a murder. To say it's adultery if you just even look at somebody with sexual intentions who you're not married to. These are very high standards, but in terms of our purpose for today, really interesting. Because when Jesus says, I have not come to abolish one dot or one iota of the law, I've come to make them stronger, he's serious. He's stricter than the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes. He's very strict. And I feel somebody thinking for himself, not necessarily towing any party line. Which to me is intellectually very interesting and opens up for me a picture of Jesus as a real individual who's not going by any of the usual ideologies and is going way beyond them. And I picture a man who tried very hard and maybe succeeded in living up to these standards, which would make him truly a remarkable person. And that this has nothing to do with Jewish, Christian, Son of God, Messiah, or whatever. Just if he lived up to these standards, I have tremendous respect for this person. Well, we're going on. Verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, makes her an adulteress. And Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Well, if you want to know where certain things in certain rules in the Catholic Church about divorce come from, about that you shouldn't get divorced and you shouldn't marry a divorced woman, things like that, here's where it comes from. Again, these are very strict guidelines. But again, he's redefining adultery. He's saying that if you divorce your wife, you're making her into adulteress. And if you marry somebody in a second marriage, a woman who'd been divorced, you're committing adultery. Again, he's reinterpreting and making the law stricter than it was. I pause to tell you something from rabbinic literature. One of my favorite passages about in all of rabbinic literature is about Shammai and Hillel. Shammai and Hillel were great sages who lived at the same time, and Shammai was the strict one, and Hillel was known as a more lenient one. And they were both asked, how do you define adultery? And Shammai says the strict definition of adultery is if you have sexual intercourse if a man has sexual intercourse with the wife of another man. And Hillel said, if your wife burns the peas, you should divorce her. Shammai said you can only divorce over adultery. If your wife has sex with another man, you can divorce her. That's the only reason. If you just don't like her, if you don't get along, that's not a reason, because you will be making, you cannot do that. And Hillel says you've burned the peas. I have to tell you, it took me something like 25 years to figure out what Hillel was talking about. He was saying, if your wife burns the peas and you have such an argument that you want to get divorced, you probably can't hold this marriage together anymore. There's a certain simple, sagely wisdom from Hillel saying, it's not always just the big things that lead to divorce. It's not always adultery. There are other reasons too. And sometimes two people can't be together anymore. And so as opposed to Shammai and Jesus' very strict definition of why you can get divorced, Hillel says, sometimes two people can't be together. And divorce in Judaism goes back to the Torah. And we learn how a man gives a bill of divorcement to his wife back in Deuteronomy, back, at least according to tradition, in the days of Moses. So divorce has always been part of things. And that doesn't mean we're happy about it, obviously. But sometimes two people can't be together. Hillel understood that. But I'm not sure Shammai did. And I'm not sure, frankly, that Jesus did. And the Catholic Church to this day, in frowning on divorce, I'm not sure that they understand sometimes the necessity of divorce. And that's with all due respect. So I'm going on to verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. Okay, in the Ten Commandments, he's going through the Ten Commandments, and he's talking about redefining what those commandments should mean in his time. So he says, okay, you should not swear falsely. We know that's what the commandment is. But I say to you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So again, he's expanding what swearing falsely means. He says, don't swear at all. Don't go near it. And again, he's being stricter than any of the movements of his time. Verse 38. You've heard that it was said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's true. It says that in the Torah. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you. Okay, so there's a passage, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What does that mean in the Torah? It means somebody hurts you, somebody hits you, hit him back. It doesn't mean literally if he gouges out your eye, God forbid, you should gouge out his eye if he knocks out your tooth. It's saying there should be recompense. There should be justice. There's certainly a lot of laws in Judaism that if somebody injures you in some way, there should be compensation for that, not hitting him back. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part says, do not resist one who is evil. If somebody is evil and they attack you and they strike you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek, the other also. You've heard this a million times. Turn the other cheek. That's what people will say to you. Turn the other cheek. But what does that really mean? Have you ever thought about this? If somebody hits you on this cheek, give him this cheek so he can hit you on that one too. This is the opposite of an eye for an eye. So now we're not in the Ten Commandments, but Jesus is talking about other Jewish laws, and he's changing things. He's saying that you've got to take it. You shouldn't fight back. If he wants to sue you and take your coat, let him have your coat. So this is a very different attitude. And again, if you agree with this, and I don't, if you think that you should turn the other cheek and let him hit you on the other cheek, it's certainly a remarkable way to live, and it sounds very pacifistic. Now, let's remember the historical context. The historical context is they lived in the time of the Romans. Let's remember that there were people who were apocalypticists who wanted to rebel against Rome. He doesn't fit with those guys. Those guys were saying, if Rome does something, let's get them back. And they will eventually rebel against Rome, and they will cause a revolution that will lead to the destruction of the temple and great suffering to the people. But Jesus is saying, don't be an apocalypticist. Now, that's sort of interesting for other reasons, because Jesus had a guy with him, Judas Iscariot, and Iscariot, this is Sicarii, a dagger man. He was one of the assassins, one of the most radical of those apocalypticists. And if Judas Iscariot is a historical figure, that means that Jesus had as a very close friend somebody from that group of those assassins, of those dagger men. When the Romans come to arrest Jesus, what does he say? He says, put away your swords, which means that they had swords. So where do we place Jesus in his time and in his place? There's some intriguing hints from the Christian scriptures. Again, this is not from Jewish texts. This is all from Christian scriptures, that perhaps he had ties to all sorts of people. And again, I come back to this vision I'm trying to come up with of Jesus, this picture, I should say, of Jesus, of somebody who was an individual who might have attracted people from different movements because he did think for himself. And the other word on my mind is synthesis. What if Jesus was creating a new synthesis of Judaism? A new way of thinking about it. But it's not reforming Judaism to lesser standards. It's reforming Judaism to stricter standards, as you can see. A very famous passage still coming up. You've heard that it was said you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Again, probably thinking only about the Romans, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. Again, he's not saying here, I'm the Son of God, right? He's saying you are all sons of your Father. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Who are the Gentiles? The Gentiles are non-Jewish people. He's a Jewish man talking to Jewish people. And he's saying, even the Gentiles, even the non-Jewish person is living up to this, right? You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And he goes on in this passage. He says, when you pray, you should not be like the hypocrites. And he says, here's how you should pray. You should pray sincerely. So for this session, for this time, I've just tried to make the following point, and in the next session, I'll make some other points about Jesus and the law, that from this one speech, the Sermon on the Mount, we get a picture of Jesus which is probably different than most people have, both Christian and Jewish. We think of Jesus as somebody who was starting a new religion. He says the opposite, and explicitly, I have not come to start a new religion. A lot of people think of Jesus as a kind of reformed Jewish person. If anything, if he's reforming things, it's to be stricter in our daily conduct than one would have ever imagined. But certainly noble goals, certainly great things to think about. Even to going back to the way we talk to each other, the idea of even trying to hold yourself to a standard where you don't call people names is something worth thinking about, because our daily lives are filled with mistakes of that nature that we make. And if we could do a little bit better, we would be better, and the people around us would be better. So again, next time I'll talk more about Jesus and the law.